All right. So where we left off, we cloned a repo. Now, when working in most modern front-end projects, you're going to end up with a big, messy folder structure right out the gate. You usually have to start with some base code because there's some base setup that goes along with it, allowing us to use things like import and export. By default, a browser does not support import and export, nor is it likely to anytime in the near future, if ever. So in order to use import and export, we have to kind of fake it. Okay? Importing and exporting of JavaScript is completely for the developer. Okay? It has nothing to do with the end result of the product. What we're actually going to be using is a thing called Webpack. Some of you maybe have heard the term. And we'll do a light, very light introductory to talk about a little bit about what Webpack actually is. So I always felt the image on Webpack's homepage sums it up very nicely about what exactly Webpack does. Now, of course, as we continue to build projects, we'll talk about Webpack more and more. It is a topic that you need to be aware of, but not something you necessarily need to dive into right this second. Okay? Having a general idea of what it's doing for you is enough for the moment. And what it is doing for you is it's taking all kinds of files and folder structure that the web browser can't do anything with. So what your dev environment looks like, and then bundling it all into a nice tight package of something that the browser could actually use. So in this example, it has a bunch of like SAS files and all kinds of stuff, and then it converts all that to a single CSS file, single JavaScript file, and it can even resize your images and do all kinds of cool stuff for you. The main thing that we're concerned with that it's doing right now is that it's taking all of your JavaScript files and turning them into one single JavaScript file. And that's the only way that you could use import and export with front-end development. And like I said, we're going to talk on it a little bit more. That's not going to be the end of it. The other tool that we'll be using and you get intimately familiar with is NPM. Anybody know what NPM stands for? That's what it used to stand for.
No prescribed meaning.
So that's actually closer to the truth. So NPM originally stood for Node Package Manager. It was a package manager for Node. A package is essentially pre-written code that you're going to use. It's like a library. Okay. An example of a package you might use on the front end would be jQuery. You guys have already been using jQuery. Before, you used a script tag with a CDN link, right? You have this big long URL, put in a script tag, and it would download all the jQuery code for you. With NPM, we could NPM install jQuery, which we're going to do in a minute. And that downloads all the jQuery library to your computer. Okay? So then we no longer have to use CDNs, and we can just import jQuery where we need it. And then this also allows for us, like I said, to use importing and exporting. Now they changed the name of NPM because, once again, it was intended for Node, but it grew exponentially in popularity, and it's not used just for Node projects anymore. It's used for all kinds of different projects. Hence the name, why they changed it. Now NPM just means NPM. It really doesn't have any meaning, just like Tim said. Okay? So we will be using NPM quite extensively. So there's a few commands that you're going to get very familiar with. First one we're going to do is we need to install all the dependencies that this project needs. And if you open the package.json file, you can see there's some base information about the project and some other stuff. A script section, which we'll come back to. And then there's a section called dev dependencies and a section called dependencies. Okay, so dev dependencies are stuff that your project needs while in development, but does not need when it's actually deployed. Okay, so right now we have a bunch of dev dependencies that all have to do with Babel. Okay, Babel is the transpiler that I was talking about earlier that takes all your ES6 and fancy code and turns it back into something that's more compatible across all browsers. Babel will also be very key into us coding React, and we'll talk more about that when we actually get to React. Now, what's very important to note here as well is this is not a React project. Okay, the setup is very similar to what the React project is going to look like, but this project does not contain React. It's not set up for React. This is more to focus on ES6, importing, exporting, and Webpack as a whole. Okay? So if this was a React project, the dependencies would contain React-related stuff. Okay? Right now, there's no actual dependencies in this project. So you guys did a little bit of Node, right? Yeah. Anything from this list look familiar from Node? Express. Okay? So bring on the confusion. You guys ready for this? So your front end code will use a Node Express server to build your code while you're coding in it. Okay? Because we are going to be using multiple files, importing and exporting, that all has to be built into a single JavaScript file for your browser to run it, even to test it. Okay? So you have to have a server that's kind of going behind the scenes and constantly building your project as you make changes to it. Now, that does not mean that your project has to have a Node Express backend. Okay? Completely unrelated. Strictly for development purposes. But we do have to have a separate server running to develop in this style project. And this style project is pretty common nowadays, regardless of which framework you're using. Vue, Angular, React, any of them, you would have a Webpack project set up like this. Right? What else? All right, so what we need to do now is to run our project, we need to install all this stuff. Okay, now it'd be a pain in the butt if we had to look at this list and then manually type out all this stuff to install. That's the whole purpose of this list, is so we don't have to do that. As dependencies get added to the project, these lists get updated. So when someone else goes to work on your project, they could clone the repository and do what we're about to do and just automatically install all the stuff that's listed here. And to do that, we're going to run a command in our terminal. So you want to make sure you're in the proper folder, the ES6 playground. So make sure you CD'd into it after cloning it. And remember, if yours doesn't tell you what directory you're in, you can always type pwd to get an accurate representation of where you're at. At the very end of when you type pwd, it should be ES6 playground. And then we're going to type npm install. Right, just by itself, just like that, we're going to hit enter. When you clone a new project and you type npm install, it's going to reference that package.json file and then go through and check all the dependencies that are in there, and then it's going to download all of those and any child dependents that any of those other things have. So you can see, although there's only 5 or 6 things actually listed here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's actually 6 dependencies listed here, but when we type npm install, it actually installs 562. Now, depending on your operating system and a few other things, the amount of packages you got might be slightly different. Okay, it's OS dependent. So if you're on Windows, you're probably going to get a different amount of packages versus if you're on a Mac. And even different versions of those could still vary a little bit as well. Now you notice when we install these, we have this thing that says 152 moderate severity vulnerabilities found. And this is what GitHub was warning us about as well. If you guys remember when I first went to GitHub, there was a big yellow banner saying, hey, security alert. Okay, it is telling me that some of my packages are essentially out of date. Okay, they've found some vulnerabilities in some of the packages that this project is using, and it's letting you know there's some security holes. Okay, and they rate from moderate to extremely severe. I think it's moderate, severe, and low. Low, moderate, and severe. All right, for this project, we don't care about this. We're never going to do anything else with this project ever again, other than just play around with it. But if you ever run across this in a project that you are planning on deploying, then you want to fix these issues, okay? And usually they're fairly easy to fix. It tells you right here how to fix them. npm audit fix. And that will update the packages. Most of the time, 99% of the time even, it is just because you're using something that is outdated, okay? It's usually not too huge of a real problem, but you don't want any possible security vulnerabilities where you can avoid them. So let's go ahead and run npm audit fix and see how much of it it'll clean up on ours. Yes.
On Windows, it's taking a long time to install.
Yes. Yep. Well, depending on your computer, and I don't mean this as a dig at Windows, it's just fact. For whatever reason, npm installing on Windows is a little bit slower. What makes it even slower beyond that is if you have a mechanical hard drive versus a solid state hard drive, because all this stuff gets downloaded and written to your hard drive. So if you have a mechanical hard drive, it's a little bit slower, and just by default, it's a little bit slower on Windows for whatever reason. And just to make it a little extra fun for you guys on Windows, a lot of times it'll look like it's not doing anything. So that's normal.
Is there a reason why it's like that? Just to like say.
I don't know why it's a little bit slower. So you'll get the biggest difference depending on your hard drive, but just like I said, Windows is just a little bit slower anyways.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Should we restart?
No.
Plus, you're downloading thousands of files.
Yes.
All at the same
Yep.
time.
The real bad news is this is actually a very small project. When we get to like the React project and stuff, it's much bigger, so it'll take even longer to install.
Are they trying to force us to use Macs?
Yeah, I get $50 every time one of you buys a Mac. Make sure you say my name at the Mac store.
Discount, right?
Wish. Now, for development, Linux-based systems are definitely a better way to go, for the most part. Unless you're developing in .NET or something like that. And I hated Apple up until I started developing. So.
I got an arrow.
Right.
I'm out.
Timed out. My computer. Just run it again. Sometimes it takes about 3 tries. It does.
Oh.
Just let it do its thing.
30 times all this shot.
Yeah. It's got, she's
Episode just.
5,000. Oh yeah, 5,553.
Yeah.
Oh. 5, 5, 6, 3.
So, guys, if you are on Windows and it airs out, just run the command again. Unfortunately, there's not a better solution to it. At least not one that I'm aware of. Anybody else having any issues? We'll wait a minute for everyone to get caught up.
Yeah.
How do you fix the vulnerability?
Oh, NPM audit fix.
Is it like a, or do you just type that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Just NPM audit fix and then enter. If you are on a slower computer and the NPM install is taking a very long time, don't do the NPM audit fix. It's not that big a deal for this project, and that takes usually longer than the install does. So just leave it for now. Well, at least you guys are in good company. A lot of you have slow computers, so normally it's just like one person in the class. Everyone else to wait for. Makes it feel bad.
Mac has poor processor. That's what to say.
Yeah, Macs do a lot less though.
What's the expensive? Just like.
Yeah, if you just go off of straight specs, it looks like you're not getting much for the price. It's all LIDO. Because Macs are way faster, especially for stuff like.
Plus they have they're Unix, so they have like a real bash shell.
Yep.
So it's like
Something
what you want as a developer.
That fixes any of the security vulnerabilities that might be in the project. And what it mostly does, it just updates version numbers, especially from the phone. Yeah, you see that. Mine puts zero in front of it. You try running it, and
Yours
usually
is
gives
faster
you
than
an error.
mine. It took 38 minutes.
Right on top.
I'm dealing with researching within the current
Are you on the YouTube? Are you on the dark side? I forgot to change it to the dark side. So
doesn't do anything. You need two things.
Anybody still running? It's okay if it is. It's not your fault. Everyone's good?
yes.
All right. So what I want everyone to do now is, so in our folder structure, we have devserver.js. Okay, so this is the server that runs, that builds our project while we're in development. Right? It is a node server that has some Webpack middleware that handles actually, monitoring your file system. Anytime that you save and there's changes, it will rebuild that main bundle file that your whole project is running off of. So, you guys, in Node, you guys made a file and then ran the file with Node, right?
Yeah.
So what was the command to run a file with Node? Node and then the file name. So if we type node and then dev_server.js, that should execute that file using Node. All right, and then you'll notice you'll get some output. You'll get dev server running at localhost 3000, Webpack compiling, some gibberish, and then compiled successfully. Okay? The thing we care about the most is that it compiled successfully. Now, we haven't done anything in the code, so there's no reason why it shouldn't have compiled successfully. All right, the other thing of note is that the dev server is running at localhost 3000. So in our browser, we could go to localhost 3000. Now it's very, very important to note, guys. I cannot stress this one enough. And open your console, and you should see a console log in there. If you don't see the console log, something was not quite right. So very important to know, where you guys are used to, especially if you use like PHP Storm or something, you're used to just going up to the top right corner and clicking on the little Chrome icon. You cannot do that for these projects. Okay? They are running on their own server. You have to go to whatever port that it's running on. Most of the front end stuff will be on 3000. Okay? There's no real reason for that other than it's just a commonly used one for front end stuff. And that would just depend on the group of developers you're running in. Some, you could run it on any host of port numbers. These 3000 does seem to be fairly common though. Did anybody's not work? Cool. So this process will be very similar in React. Now, once again, this is not a React project, but a lot of the same setup and all the same stuff is the exact same. All right, so what I want to point out next is if we go back to the package.json file, and we look at the scripts section, okay? There's a couple predefined scripts in here. If you notice right here, that should look very familiar. That's what we just typed into the terminal, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So to start your dev server, it is using that. That's the command used to start your dev server. With npm, though, you could define some predefined scripts. So we could, instead of having to type that out every time, we could type npm start. Okay, and then that runs this command in the terminal, and it will do the same exact thing. So what I want everyone to do now is go back to your terminal, stop your server, Control C as in cat. Most of the time, if you're ever stuck somewhere in your terminal, Control C almost always will get you out of it, with few exceptions. There are exceptions, though. All right, so Control C stops the server. And then what I want you guys to do is type npm space start. And you're going to see this command a lot. But realistically, it's running node space dev_server.js. It's running the same exact code. It's just kind of like a shortcut. And while that might sound a little pointless, for this exact command, it is a little pointless. But a lot of times, to start the server, it's more complex of a command than what we're using here. So if we had more complex command, this would save us from having to type it every time. Okay? So like I said, I know it might seem a little redundant here, kind of is, but most projects are set up to run, use npm start to start them. And then you'll notice there's a couple other commands here. There's a bundle command. We'll talk about that shortly. And then there's a test command that doesn't actually do anything. It just echoes that there's no test, which means it just prints that out in the terminal. And you could define your own scripts here. You could call them anything you want. You can make a script super cool, awesome run or something, whatever. And then you could use that, and it could do whatever it is you need it to do. So when we talk a little bit more about like project setup and stuff like that, we'll expand on that a little bit. But I just want to make it as clear as possible that npm start is actually just running the command you already know. Because I know it could be confusing in the beginning. When do I use npm? When do I use node? It's going to be confusing for a little bit. All right. Everybody's server started back up. okay? Everybody got the good same messages? One thing to note, another asterisk for the Windows users. Sometimes when you stop your server, it doesn't shut down properly. So you'll go to start another new server and it will throw an error that, you know, hey, there's a listen error, it can't start the server because you can only have one server per port. Okay, so if you wanted to run another server, you'd have to run it on a different port. But sometimes you can be like, I stopped my server and then I npm started again and it crashed. Okay, that happens on Windows sometimes. If that happens to you, just, you know, let one of the instructors know and we'll fix it for you. It's fairly easy to fix. You just open your task manager, Alt-Control-Delete, task manager, and then find any node processes and manually stop them. That will fix the issue. But if you run into that issue and you forget what I just said, just come see myself or one of the other instructors. And once again, I have no idea why that happens on Windows. It just does. It's better than it used to be, though. They fixed something because it used to be, I'm sure it has something to do with Bash, but it used to be every time you stop the server, it would do that. Now it only does it sometimes. So it's getting better. Another big one, too, is make sure Control-C, not Control-Z. Z does not close it. It just moves it to the background. I would avoid doing that. Was there a question back there? No. All right. So let's actually play around with this a little bit. So one advantage to using npm is that we can easily install stuff. Okay? So for this example, we're going to install jQuery. Now, very important, guys. Do not install jQuery into a React project. Okay? There's nothing that jQuery could do that React can't do, with the exception of Ajax. But there's other things to handle that. Okay? So if you're ever like, oh, I can't figure out how to do this in React, I'm just going to npm install jQuery so I could add a class to this element. Do not do that. If you can't figure out how to do something, ask, because there's always some way to do it. There's absolutely nothing you can do in jQuery that you can't do in React. Except with the exception of Ajax, but Ajax we'll be using a different library for. All right. So when your server is running, you cannot enter commands here. They won't do anything. I mean, you can type, it'll let you type, but it doesn't actually do anything. So to enter additional commands, you need to either A, stop the server, and then restart it again once you're done, which can get cumbersome. Or you could open up another terminal, which is probably the preferred way to do it. If you are on Mac, you can hit Command-Shift-T. That will open a new tab. Was I not in the right place when I did that? Stop it. Oh, sorry, just Command-T, no Shift. Don't actually key presses in there. So on Mac, Command-T will open a new tab. If you're on Windows, I don't know or think there's a shortcut for that, so you just have to open a whole new terminal window and then navigate to the right folder. There's going to be something down the road that Macs have an issue with that Windows do not. There's one thing. One thing.
What's that one thing?
It has to do with images.
Oh, okay, never mind.
Yeah.
Having a different problem.
Yeah. Are you having a problem?
Oh, yeah. I'm saying that's
Currently having a problem.
So this is actually happening.
So if you don't want to, like I said, if you're on Windows, you don't want to deal with opening another window, that's fine. You just have to stop your server to enter commands. Now, if you're using VS Code or PHP Storm, they have a built-in terminal, and it's really easy to open new tabs in there. However, it's a little iffy to be running like all your npm stuff through the VS Code terminal with Windows. You'd mostly be okay. Just know that you might have some weird side effects. You guys got to figure it out?
Yeah.
Cool. So at this point, everybody should be in a terminal window that they could run commands. Either A, you stopped your server, you opened a new tab, you opened a new window, something. Anyway, somewhere that you could enter commands again, and you should be in the ES6 playground folder.
I'm trying to open a second terminal, but it doesn't recognize desktop when I go into desktop.
Anybody else have any issues? Who here thought front-end development would be easier than back-end development? Yeah, you guys haven't seen nothing yet.
What? Oh. Yeah.
Everyone up here, you guys all good?
Yes.
Excellent.
Very good.
I use
So guys, I'm sure a lot, if not all, this could feel pretty overwhelmed by all this, and rightfully so. It's a lot being thrown at you in one day, and it's only going to keep coming. Just keep in mind though, we're going to be doing this stuff daily now, and we'll be walking through it. I'm not going to just like, okay, now you guys know it. You're on your own. Good luck. So we will be going through this stuff again and again, making sure that you really start to get an understanding of what the hell all this is actually doing. All right. So now that we are a place that we could run some commands, we want to install jQuery. So I mentioned before what you had to do was, find a CDN, put a script tag in your index file. Now what we could do is we could type npm install. It's also very important that you make sure you're in your project directory when you run this. And then -- save. And then the name of what you want to install. In this case, jQuery, jQuery. All right. So npm install tells npm that you want to install something. -- save is technically deprecated, meaning you don't have to type it anymore. I just feel better about it when I do, so I still do. But what it's actually intended purpose of -- save is that you're installing it to the local project and you want it to write to the package.json file. Okay, so you want it to update the package.json file. Now, by default, npm just does that on npm installs now anyways. Okay? But I don't trust it because when I learned it, you had to do -- save, which may or may not even been the truth back then. In my mind, it was. Anyways, I still type -- save. It makes me feel better about it. But technically speaking, it should work without the -- save.
Does it always grab the latest version of jQuery?
Yes. So I'll show you right now. So we're going to hit enter. And if we look at our package.json file now that dependency section has jQuery. And then it tells you it installed 3.3.1. You could specify different version numbers when you npm install stuff. Okay, you could tell it to npm install version 1 of jQuery if you really wanted to. Or you could have it even npm install the latest and greatest non-stable version. Okay? So, but by default, if you just specify the package name, it will give you the most updated stable version, stable release of that package, which is usually where you want to be. Okay, very rarely would you want to go outside of that, unless you're just trying to do something crazy. Anybody have any issues in npm installing jQuery? All right, so now that we have it installed, we can use it. So a couple other things I want to point out before we dive into the actual code is that all JavaScript has to be loaded through an HTML file. And you cannot directly load a JavaScript file into a browser. It will just print out the text if you do. I'm sure some of you have probably done that on accident, if not on purpose, trying to run it. That's how I learned that it doesn't work. I thought, hey, I can just run it this way. That was not the case. All right, so every website has an HTML file that's loaded somewhere. Even if it's a single HTML file, there's still an HTML file somewhere. And for this project, that is the index.html. Okay, a React project is very similar. There's a single index file for your whole application to load into. So if we take a quick look at it, this should look pretty familiar. Nothing too crazy here. It is just a regular HTML file. One thing that is interesting about it is the script tag at the bottom. Now there's script dist/bundle.js. And if you look over to the file structure, there is no dist folder, let alone a bundle.js file. Okay? It doesn't exist. When we start our dev server, this is what our dev server is actually making. When the dev server is running, though, it does not write it to your actual hard disk. It just keeps it in memory so that we can quickly update it and make changes to it. When you actually go to deploy your project, you have to have that file built. We'll talk about that as soon as we get some actual code that we can play around with it. Okay? But this is what connects this to the JavaScript we're going to be writing. Okay? This is how it knows what it knows to load. All right, a couple other things of note is there's a div in here with an ID of root. We're going to be using that to target so we could add some stuff to the DOM. Everybody remember jQuery? You guys haven't forgotten it yet, have you? Okay. I always get nervous every time I get to this part because I don't use jQuery that much anymore. So, all right. So inside of our app folder, this is where all of our JavaScript code is going to live for this particular project. Okay, so anything we want to do in JavaScript, it has to be inside the app folder. Yes, sir.
So that's index.js, right? It's not being loaded onto our HTML.
Not directly, no. Okay. We'll circle back around to the bundle thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, if you look, this is trying to find a dist folder with a bundle file on it, but that doesn't exist anywhere. But we do have app index.js. And if you look in that index.js, there's a console log. And if you go back to your browser and look in the console, you'll see that that console log did, in fact, fire. Okay? And I know when you first kind of look at this, it's like, how does all this connect together? Okay? We'll circle back around to it shortly. All right. So inside of this index.js, let's delete this console log. And when we want to import, when we want to use something that we npm installed, like in our case jQuery, okay, it could be anything you npm installed though. To get access to it, you have to import it. Okay, every file is its own isolated scope. Okay, so just because you imported something on one file doesn't mean it's accessible everywhere else. Okay, so if we want to use jQuery in multiple files, we have to import it into each of those files separately. So in this case, we want to use jQuery here, so we're going to say import $from, and when it is a node module, something that we npm installed, we just specify the module name. Okay, whatever word you use to npm install it, that is the same word that you'll use to actually import it. So when we type npm install jQuery to import it, we import from jQuery. Okay. Now, I imported and then called it $. Why would I do such a thing?
That's the jQuery selector.
That's what you guys are used to, and that's what most people know jQuery as. Now, the thing that's really important here, though, is that I could have called it anything I wanted. Okay, I am essentially like creating a variable here to hold jQuery. So this right here is defined by you. Okay, you could think of it as like creating a variable essentially. So I could have said import bunnies from jQuery and it would still work. Okay. This is when you're grabbing something as a whole, the default export of that library. We'll talk about more what that means momentarily.
Is that true for every import we do? The variable?
Kind of. So if there's no curly brackets involved, then yes. Okay, but we'll get to named exports in a minute.
So is bunnies replaced by $sign now? Did you do that?
No, so I would use bunnies instead of $signs. Yeah. So it never created anything called $sign. So it's just bunnies now.
So can we name it like? Is there any restrict of naming it?
Only the same restrictions of any normal variable name. So can't start with a number. Can only have $, underscore, capital, and lowercase letters. So normal variable restrictions, but other than that, no. So now, with all that said, and all very good questions, guys, should I call it bunnies? As I was saying, I already knew where that was going to go. Jokingly, yes, because bunnies are adorable. But for cereal, no, you shouldn't. Watching South Park recently. So we want to call it to what either the name of the package is, or if it has some other popular moniker. Like in this case, jQuery. Everybody knows jQuery as $. This also gives you a lot of good flexibility too, though, because if you're using some other library that uses $, you can easily, give it different names, and you're not limited to whatever they pre-named it in their code. Okay, you can import it as anything you need or want. Okay, and once again, I know this isn't going to make too much sense right now, but this is only true for things that are default exports. So usually grabbing like everything as a whole. Okay, there's a way we could kind of piecemeal it where the name does matter. We'll circle back around to that. All right, so now that we have jQuery, let's do something with it. So if we remember in our index.html, there is a div with an ID of root. So if we target our div with an ID of root, $, Shalom, and good evening to you. All right, this lecture is not about jQuery, but if I do something that you're not familiar with, feel free to ask. But the main focus isn't going to be on jQuery. Yes, sir.
What we do like with the object notation, just like add a class. No, sorry, add text to it instead of putting directly on like that.
You could. It's just quicker to write that way. If you wanted to do more manipulation to it, then yes, you should do it that way. If this is all you're ever intended to do, this way is perfectly legit. Now, why you'd be adding an H1 like this with jQuery is a whole other question to be discussed. But so if you look at your terminal where your server is running, you should notice that there's been more output. Okay. As your file gets saved, it has to rebuild the bundle file. Okay? So remember, it's not directly running off the code we're writing. It is building a bundle file that contains the entire jQuery library, plus some Webpack information, plus the code you wrote. All right, so that file has to be rebuilt as you make changes to your code. Now, the first time it builds it, it takes the longest. Does this one have the time? This one does not. The other one we do actually tells you how long it took to build it. The first time you build your code, it takes the longest. After that, it's very smart and very modularizes it, so it can just kind of update the parts it needs to, so it bundles very quick. Now, this is another sticking point if you have a little bit older of a computer and you're using autosave. If you're using autosave, a little bit older computer, it's constantly trying to build this file with almost every key press you're making, and it can make your computer really tired and your fans will be going off and stuff like that. It's not an issue unless you run into it being an issue. Okay? If you're comfortable with autosave, keep autosave on. You might, however, run into the issue of it stressing your computer a little bit. Ultimately, it's probably not going to hurt anything. It's not that big a deal. But there is something to be said for having more control over the save process. So completely up to you guys. Just be aware of it. But every time that I saved, it rebundled. If you have autosave on, you might have a few extra rebundles in there. So that means it updated our code. So if we go back to our browser, we should be able to refresh the page. And then we should see hello from jQuery if your jQuery was correct. Anybody not get their thing to show up?
Is there any
Yes.
difference between the uppercase Q and lowercase? Do we always do lowercase or we?
So like for here when we import it, here it needs to be lowercase. Unless it fixes it, but I don't think it might, I don't know. It might auto locate everything. Oh. Looks like it still works. If I had to guess, I would say it probably lowercases all the letters. It's case insensitive. But I would stick to keeping everything lowercase. So, as I just learned, because a very good question was just asked, doesn't matter if you capitalize the Q. I actually didn't know, never really thought about it before. So it doesn't. Okay, you can capitalize the whole thing. Apparently it's case insensitive, which is nice. However, I would recommend everybody just writing all your imports with all lowercase. Okay? Unless you have a file name with a capital letter, which I personally am not a huge fan of. But that is personal preference. All right, so we've installed a library, we've used the library. Now what we want to do is we want to write our own code in a separate file and then bring that code over to here. All right, so I'm going to make a file called helpers.js. Inside of the app folder, helpers.js. Again, it needs to be inside the app folder. All right, and in it, I want to write a little helper function for quickly and easily adding stuff to the DOM. Okay, so in order to do that, I need jQuery. So I, again, need to import jQuery. So import $sign from jQuery. All right, and then I want to be able to import. So I want to be able to write a function that I could then use in other files in my project. So to do that, I say export default function add to DOM. And we're just going to make it so it adds an H1 to the DOM every time, and we're just going to pass it some text that we want it to say. And we'll do it the fancy way. We'll say const H1 equals, oh my gosh, me and that L are having an issue today. And in there we want to create an H1. And then we will use object for configuration. And we'll say we want to set the text equal to text. That's a great example of where we could have kept that on one line and just use text inside the curly bracket. But it could be very, like I said, could very easily get something that's relatively simple of what's happening. If it's written like this, it can be much more confusing to look at, right? All right, and then what we want to do is now we want to target that root element. So hashtag root append RH1. All right, so create H1, set its text to whatever we pass into the function, and then append it to the root element. So what we want to do now, yes, sir.
Isn't the constant H1? I'm sorry, within the curly braces, so wouldn't it not be able to read it?
Wait, what?
Wait, isn't that, it's not constant in these curly braces, wasn't it? I think you can identify it. Or am I thinking about it differently?
Well, you're right, just not in this context. Yeah, so it is bracket scoped, but the H1 is only, it's defined within the function, so I could use it anywhere in the function. Good, you know, ask those questions, I'll get the clarity. All right, so now that we've defined our little helper function, we want to use this in our main file being the index.js. So I'm actually going to delete what we did in here before. So delete everything from index.js. There's a pretty much identical example in what we just built. All right, so now we want to use the function that we built. Okay. Very important to note, when we built our function, we said export default. Okay, that makes it the default export of this file. Okay, you can only have one export default per file, one per file. Okay, now there's ways to export multiple things from the same file. We'll get to that in a minute, but you can only have one export default per file. And then just as a reminder, guys, all this information is in the slides that are in today's agenda as well. All right, so to import it, it looks pretty much the exact same. Import, give it some type of name. Now here's where the first real difference comes in. Okay? Now that we're importing something that we made, we need to specify a starting folder for it, a starting location. Okay, and that's always going to either be the current directory, or if you need to go back a directory, you could go back a directory. Okay, but you always have to specify a starting directory. That's how it knows the difference between the npm installed node modules and just custom stuff that you are importing that you built. All right, and you see it actually already came up, helpers, like that. And helpers is that file name. Now, when it is a JavaScript file, you do not need .js. It assumes everything you're importing is a JavaScript file.
That was my
I'm good.
question. Spot on.
When we get down the road and we're importing things other than JavaScript files, then you will need to specify the file extension. But for right now, we're only messing with JavaScript files, so you do not need the extension. Yes, sir.
So if you don't specify the in this folder, it goes into the node modules?
Yes.
Okay.
And we'll try and look in the node modules, and it won't find it, and then it'll yell at you and not work. Yeah, this, when you specify a starting folder, it assumes that you're telling it where to go. If you don't specify a starting folder, it's assuming to look into the node modules folder. And then because we use the default keyword here, that gives us the ability to call this anything we want again. Okay? It doesn't even matter what we called this here. This is because we used export default, this name right here is completely superfluous. It doesn't matter. We could even, in fact, have made this an anonymous function and it would work the exact same way. Okay? And there is a little bit added bonus. If you give it a name, it can help with your debugging a little bit, because anonymous functions could always be a little bit tougher to debug. So you really should give stuff names when you can. But it doesn't have to be there. Okay? Other than debugging, there's no real functional purpose to giving it a name when you are using export default. Because when you use export default, we can call it anything we want when we import it. But just like with jQuery, you should be calling it something that resembles whatever it is you're trying to do. All right, and then to call our function, we could say add to DOM, and we could pass it some text. Suppose. And with the examples and stuff, and when I'm doing text like that, you guys don't have to copy word for word. Just put something that you know is going to work. Once you think you got all that working, save it, go to your browser, refresh the browser, and see if you see your newly added H1, or unless we screwed it up. Anybody have any trouble?
So you can only import one function or one thing?
We'll get to that. Very good question. Anything else, guys? Any trouble?
I have a complaint about
Oh, really? Classes that separate curly braces because it's like an object.
Yeah, it was nasty.
Two glasses.
Can't see anything.
I'll get rid of these parentheses right here. There you go.
You like sophisticated.
When you get an error that it failed to compile, a lot of times if you go to the actual terminal
You got it.
where you have where it's actually running,
You are.
so you see it and then it points exactly to where that. It's a little bit easier to read like that.
Are you saying he doesn't?
You're smart.
Guys, I'm right here. Right here. Everyone good? All right, let's go ahead and take another quick little break, and we'll carry on when we get back. I usually try to take a break about every hour, as close as I can. Sorry.
Yes.